Hey everybody, so welcome back to Jim Bob's Garden. So today we're going to talk about raised bed gardens. You can see behind me my big raised bed area, which I absolutely love, I gotta admit. And the question though is it necessary? One. Two, is it worth it? And three, is this something we need to do, or is this just something we want to do? Let's take a whole look at all of this. Alright, so let's talk about the necessity. Do we have a necessity? Is it a need? Do we really need to have raised bed gardens? Well, I guess that all kind of depends. I will tell you, when I first got here to Jacksonville and started to grow a garden, and I looked into, the common wisdom and talked to people, and one of the things they warned me about was nematodes. Now, nematodes are bad, okay? Nematodes, particularly the root knot nematodes. Now, nematodes are not all bad. There are good nematodes and bad nematodes, but that's a subject for another video, probably beyond my level of expertise. But at any rate, so they told me about these root knot nematodes. All right, so originally that's why I created my raised beds, was to get the soil level up off of the ground and to get those areas isolated so that I would not have nematodes. Now, that is a fallacy. All right, I'm going to tell you right now that if you use raised bed gardens, unless you're somehow isolating your soil completely from the soil around you, and even then I do believe that if you mix your soil at all, there's a good chance that you're going to get root knot nematodes. So keeping root knot nematodes out of your garden by using raised beds, I think is just not going to work, unless you have a sealed raised bed where the bottom is completely covered. Because even holes that allow for drainage are going to allow those nematodes to start working their way back up into the soil. So I think there are far better ways to get rid of the root knot nematodes, like growing a lot of radishes and mustards and things of that nature, which seems to help. But it is something you just kind of got to deal with down here. All right, so that is a necessity I thought I had, but I really didn't have. There are some advantages that do make raised bed gardens nicer. Okay, and I'll tell you, one of them is crop rotation. So if I have 4 different areas, which I do, I have my 4 corners of my basic square here. What I can do is I can say, okay, well, I had tomatoes there last year, so I don't want tomatoes there this year. And the reason for that is sometimes you'll get blight, which is a type of fungus, or you'll get tomato hornworms and so on, that grow in the soil over the winter time and then come out and attack your plants the next year. And the idea of crop rotation is that by the next year, those pests that grow up in the areas where you had them last year, pests and diseases and so on, won't be present in your soil. But I have found that to be also somewhat questionable, because your raised beds are somewhat, geographically close, and unless you're moving tomatoes to a faraway location, the hornworms, which come from moths, actually will still be able to find your tomato plants. I mean, moths can go all over the place, and the same thing happens with squash bugs and vine borers and pickle worms, army worms, all of it. Primarily they're spread through other means so that they can go out and find the crops that they want. So I don't know that that's actually a necessity either. All right, so are they necessary? I would say no. Now, so raised beds are not a necessity. They're not a need. They are a want, in my opinion. All right, so that brings us to the need and want. All right, is this just a want to have, or is this something you really need? Well, there are some advantages that make it, how should we say, a high priority want. All right, one of the issues, let me show you here. So one of the things that happens with a non-raised bed is that you get something called weed creep. So like this is frog fruit, and it is slowly creeping in to my garden, and that's something that I have to defend against. I have to try and keep the weeds from creeping in And I mean, dollarweed is another one. This stuff, where is it? I'm not sure what it is. I should probably look it up. But this particular weed gets in there and really goes crazy if you're not careful. Now, that is one thing that helps. When you have a raised barrier, that keeps a lot of things that want to go into your garden from being able to crawl into the garden. So that does make it nice. But a lot of things like dollarweed will go underneath the wood and will actually, still make it into your garden. Though I got to say it's much less. Grasses like Bermuda grass and so on typically don't make it into my garden. I do have problems with nutsedge, but that I think is just an ongoing battle that I'll probably never win. All right. And then of course you have seeds that get dropped by birds, get blown by the wind, and so you're still going to have some weed pressure in your garden. And I will say that the raised beds lower that weed pressure. Now, one of the other things that I really love about my raised beds is it gives me a border. Okay. Now in the borders I can do things like marigolds here, oregano there, and these are organic bug suppressors. Alright, so the idea is that I'm able to, on the outside of the bed, plant things that will hopefully suppress bugs or trap the bugs and keep them from making it into the garden. Now I also do that with other things, like you see behind here I've got chives and so on. So, you can still interplant these things. But if you look at these marigolds, for example, they can get huge. And so you're either constantly battling to keep them small, or if you do like I do and you plant them on the outside of the bed, it seems to help. One of the other advantages of doing this is it cools this side of the bed. So another issue with raised beds can be that people say that they dry out quicker. And I got to tell you that I don't know that that's actually true. I think the 2x10s that I've used here insulate it well enough that it may dry out somewhat quicker, but not appreciably so. I don't think that that's usually the issue, and in fact I've grown as well in the raised beds as I have in the regular dirt, but I also have a lot of sand. All right, and sandy soil allows the water to go through a lot quicker no matter where you go, so I don't know that that's actually a great advantage. So is it worth it? Well, for that we really got to talk about how much it cost. So each one of these beds here took 4 12-foot 2x10s. And a 12-foot 2x10 is about 20 bucks. In the corners, to stabilize the wood, which I may have been able to do without, I put 4x4s, and we'll say I got another 10 4x4s that were cut into 2-foot sections, plus or minus a bit. So, and then I sunk them down into the ground to stabilize everything. So that's probably another $100 or so. So we're talking $500-ish just for the wood, plus screws, labor, and all of that. So is $500 worth it? Well, I like the way this looks. All right, I think for me it was worth it, but I had the money at the time to do it, and I think I would do it again because I love my little spot here. I did talk to a house appraiser at one point, who's a friend of mine. We talk every once in a while, and she was telling me that a garden does not add value to your home. Now, of course, that was about 3 years ago, before the pandemic hit and all that. So I don't know now, with the food shortages that everybody's talking about and so on, whether or not this would be a selling point. I believe it would be. And I think that this garden area here has added at least a $500, to the value of my home. I think it would make people a lot more likely to want to buy this home. And in any case, for me, because I'm not planning on selling it, but for me, it was worth it. I love my little garden spot here. I love my little area. You see, I'm always taking videos up in here. It's been fantastic, and I would do it again in a heartbeat. But for other people, is it really worth it? Well, let's talk about some of my other areas where I have things growing that are not raised beds. So behind me you see one of my non-raised beds back here. Now this area here behind me has grown very well. I've managed to grow squash, I have grown potatoes, I have grown onions and garlic. Matter of fact, my best garlic harvest ever came out of this bed. And it has been a very good producer. I have had no issue, and in fact I will tell you, I don't know that this has been any better or any worse than the raised beds themselves. Now, I will tell you first off that I was being very cheap when I built these beds. I know you're saying, wait a minute, you just told me you spent $500 on lumber alone. But what I didn't do is I didn't go out and buy dirt. Now, had I gone out and bought dirt, it probably would have been slightly better, at least for the first year or two. But I will tell you something about sand. It has been my experience that sand migrates its way up into the soil above it. I don't know exactly how, and I do mix up my beds a bit. I pull weeds, and I grow potatoes, so things get stirred up. So once again, barring a raised bed where you have isolated your dirt and kept it from mixing with the dirt underneath, I don't know that there's going to be a real appreciable difference between a raised bed and a bed that's just in the ground like what you see behind me here. And in fact, I think it might actually be better in certain instances because it doesn't raise that soil level up above and cause that heating effect, which can cause it to dry out more. Now again, I haven't really had that issue because I'm able to plant a lot of things around the outside of my bed to shade the boards. But I will tell you that right along the edges, I have had issues in the past where that edge dries out a lot more than the interior of the bed, which is an indication that the heat is getting to the raised beds and drying out the soil somewhat. But I'm also a guy, I'm retired, so I come out here and I water mine quite a bit. But that is one of the disadvantages of having a raised bed. Now, I guess I should have talked about this at the beginning, but what is a raised bed? Well, you can have something that is bordered like what I have behind me with the 2x10s, or you can have basically just mounded dirt, and that's also called a raised bed. Now, if I was really looking to build a garden as inexpensively and in the best manner actually possible, what I probably would do is go out and get or grow as much compost as possible, kill off the grass in an area, and then I would just mound up the compost on top of the existing soil. I think that in the long term is going to be a much better way of growing and way cheaper, particularly if you grow your own compost like I do. So, do you need raised beds? No. Do you want raised beds? I mean, that kind of depends on you. I like it. I think it's attractive. I like my fence that I put up around it. It's a really neat little spot for me. So, I would do it again. But do you want them? Maybe. Maybe it's something you would like to have in your garden. It does keep things somewhat neater. And if you do them to where you don't make them wider than 4 foot apart, it does keep you from stepping on the soil. But once again, I would tell you that I don't really believe that a human being stepping on the soil is really causing the amount of compaction that a lot of people worry about. Now keep in mind, I have sandy soil, which is looser by nature. I can dig my hand in and pull weeds in this soil all day long. Whereas I know if you got clay soil, that's not necessarily something you can do. So, is it a need? No. Is it a want? Maybe. Is it worth it? It really kind of depends on you. I will tell you, I don't think that it makes an appreciable difference, barring you going out and buying soil. But even buying soil, I've heard so many horror stories of people who bought soil and it's turned out to have grays on in it, or that's the persistent weed killer that can cause you trouble. Or other issues, like I saw another video where a guy was talking about he bought all new soil and had a very high salt content. And for me, that's a danger that I'm just not really willing to take or to play with, when I can use the soil that I know is already growing stuff because the grass is growing. So if I were to advise you on whether or not to get raised beds, I think my take on it would be, do you want that aesthetic? do you think it's nice? Now I will tell you another advantage. You see me here squatting on this. When it comes time to pull weeds, it is nice having that raised level so you can sit on the edge, reach in, and pull weeds. And in fact, if I were to do this all over again, I would probably put a ledge of a 2x4 all the way around the outside of the bed. And I'll link you a video. We made beds for my daughter, and I probably would have made mine something like that, because the edge gives you a spot to sit where you can reach in and grab weeds and not have to drag something like this along with you. And particularly as you get older, like with these raised beds, I'm probably going to stack another 2x10 where I get them about 20 inches, or it'll be about 18 inches, 19 inches tall. But it'll raise them up almost to seat level, to where as I get older, I can more comfortably sit on the outside edges of the beds and weed without a lot of bending over and without that constant squatting down that I currently have to do. There are a lot of designs out there of raised beds, and there's a lot of different types of raised beds, like metal raised beds and all kind of other stuff. And I'll tell you, they tend to be very expensive. And, you know, it really is a decision on your part on whether or not you want to do that. I mean, you know, does the expense justify the appearance? I think is the biggest thing. The only other thing I will tell you is that by having raised beds, you can better manage the soil that's in those beds. Like if one of these beds starts giving me problems, I can dig all the soil out and replace it with compost. Or I can go out and buy soil. And that does give you a management tool that is not as available in an in-ground garden. In an in-ground garden, even if you have bad soil and dig it out, the bad soil around it can leach into the bed area that you have. I will tell you, going back in history, when I was a young man, you know, nobody had raised beds. You might have a raised bed, you know, for decorative purposes, but as far as an actual garden, people dug in the ground. They just dug up the ground that was there, used a lot of fertilizer or cow manure or compost. Though compost wasn't nearly as popular back then. Not sure why. And then basically just added that to the soil and tilled it in, and that's how they went about raising a garden. And they grew some fantastic gardens. Now, of course, I grew up in Kansas, and in Kansas, you know, the soil is much better. It's more of a clay soil. It's had the deep roots in it for years and years and years because it was a prairie land, you know, and for thousands of years, well, I guess millions of years, I would assume, it's had massive herds of animals flocking across the plains and depositing, you know, crap in massive amounts and being ground into the soil by the hooves and urine and so on from these animals. So it's a much more fertile soil. It's also, I think, a more clay soil than what I have here as well. So that's a little bit different story, but I think you can get the same effect here. And in fact, all of my food forest areas are just wood chips that are placed on top of the soil and allowed to rot down to improve the soil. And they've done very well. I mean, I've had a really good success with growing trees and so on in the wood chips. I will tell you, well, let me show you this about these raised beds over here. I got a theory. Okay, so I made these raised beds here around my pool area, and the biggest reason for it was I was getting erosion from up underneath the concrete to where the water was washing away the soil from underneath my pool patio. And so I decided to put these raised beds up to keep that from happening, which has done a great job. But I put a lot of the wood chips on, which again are there to improve the soil, and in fact have done so. But I think having wood chips in here has made my wood rot a lot faster. I mean, the wood is really coming apart here. And, you know, of course, if you have wood chips rotting down and you have wood boards holding it in place, it only makes sense that whatever's eating the wood is going to migrate into your boards. Now, the outside boards themselves are torn apart. You can see from the area that was covered with soil. And I will tell you that that has not happened in my raised beds over there where I have not used wood chips. So I think that is something to be aware of. If you're going to put in raised beds, and you're going to use wood chips for it, you may be looking at a lot faster wood rot. At least that's been my experience. And all of this was pressure treated lumber, same as that, only these were 2x6s instead of 2x10s. So I'm going to have to come up with a better answer for how to contain this. I may do concrete blocks, I don't know, I haven't decided yet. But we're going to have to come up with something a little bit better to contain this area. Now that is one of the advantages though of a raised bed, is particularly if you're on a hillside or something. Like here, I'm pretty much flat, so I don't get a lot of erosion. But if you're on a hillside or if you have a slope to your property, raised beds can keep your soil from washing away. One of the big problems with gardens is when you get heavy rains or high winds, you can have a lot of erosion that washes away the soil that you've worked so hard to improve with your compost and what have you. And that is an issue. That's a concern. So if you are in that situation, I would say raised beds are a great thing for you. So it occurs to me that I haven't really answered your question. Should you or should you not put up raised beds for your garden? And I will tell you that I cannot. I can't tell you what you should do. And I don't know, I try really hard not to tell people what to do in their own garden, because I think that's, first off, silly, because I don't know your situation. I don't know where you're at. You might be on a mountainside, you might be on flat land, you might be in an area that floods where raised beds would be fantastic. So what I would tell you is this: sit down and do a pros and cons list. Say, what's the pros for a raised bed? Some of them would be it doesn't erode like a flatbed might. It doesn't allow you to isolate. It makes it easier to do things like weeding. As you get older, they're handier because they're raised up and you don't have to bend over quite as much. Those are all some pros of raised beds. Also, it's easier to experiment because you can do things in one bed and do them different in another bed. Some of the cons: it costs a lot of money. It really doesn't change what your soil makeup underneath is, and oftentimes that will migrate up into the bed. I mean, unless you do some sort of barrier at the bottom. The expense, of course, is one of the biggest cons. And then the other thing I would say is that it limits you. Had I just dug out this entire area, I would have had a lot more space available than doing the raised beds gave me. A pathway between raised beds usually, a couple of feet, whereas the pathway down the middle of your garden might be as narrow as your feet. So there are pros and there are cons to both sides, and it depends upon you and your situation what is actually going to be better for you. Me personally, probably my best advice for you would be to experiment. Maybe build a small raised bed and see how you like it, and then next to that grow in ground and see how that works out. If you find it works better for you to do a raised bed, then by all means do raised beds if you have the money and the time to put them together. But I can't tell you what to do because every garden is different, every individual is different. The needs and wants, financial resources, time resources, and all of that are individual to everybody. I mean, that's the thing with so many things in the world right now, is we try and lump everybody into a group. We try and label people. And I will tell you that it just doesn't work out well, because everybody is different. Everybody has a different setup, a different situation, a different environment. And for me to try and tell you based upon my experiences and my environment what to do would just be silly. So back to the original 3 questions. 1, is it a necessity? No, it's not a necessity. You don't have to have raised beds. And for those of you who are out there and like, man, I'd love to grow a garden, but I can't afford to buy all these raised beds that I need, I'm going to tell you that you don't need them. They are not a necessity. All right. Are there advantages to it? There can be. It helps to prevent erosion. It allows you to isolate crops. It makes it easier to rotate your crops because you have selected areas where you have had crops last year and where you can move it to the new area the following year. And lastly, is it worth it? I mean, that is completely a subjective question. If you're trying to grow food because you're concerned about upcoming crises, or you just want to save a lot of money on your groceries, then dropping $500 on a raised bed setup like this is probably not in your best interest. I mean, it takes a lot of groceries, it takes a lot of vegetables in particular, to pay back the $500 that you might have dropped on building these raised beds. Is it worth it? I mean, really, that just depends on you. All right, for me, yes, I love my little garden area here, and when I'm dead and gone, and maybe all of these non-raised beds start going back to the lawn, hopefully this area will still be here, and people will be like, wow, check that out, nice little garden back here. It's a spot that I want to go to and plant some things, so I can grow food in my house. So, bottom line, should you do raised beds? Just like everything else in gardening, that depends on you and your situation and what works for you. I like them, but I'm probably not going to do any more of them. I'm going to continue to expand my in-ground gardens. I'm probably going to take this one a little further that way, maybe take out this whole section here, haven't decided quite yet. But in the end, I'm probably not going to spend a whole bunch of money building raised beds unless I come up with another idea, something like this, where I want something that's decorative as well as functional. Alright, thanks for stopping by. Hopefully that answered any questions you might have had about raised beds. And if not, please drop some questions in the comments. I'll let you know what I think, and you can take that for what it's worth. Advice is freely given and just as freely ignored. Alright, but anyway, thanks once again for stopping by. Do me a favor, give me a like and subscribe, and let me know what you think. Most importantly, grow something. And you don't need raised beds to do it, but you might still want them. Just kind of depends on you. Alright, y'all take care and come back and see me.